This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The quiet beginning. When I stopped explaining my life, I didn't break down. I didn't lose everything. There was no dramatic collapse, no public unraveling, no moment that anyone around me would point to and say, "That's when it all went wrong." From the outside, my life looked composed, respectable, stable. I was functioning at a level that earned approval. I showed up on time. I kept promises. I handled responsibility without complaint. I smiled when asked how I was doing and answered with the kind of words that make people comfortable. I'm good, busy, but good. And that was the problem. Because good slowly became a mask I forgot how to take off. What drained me wasn't the work, or even the weight of obligation. It was the constant explaining, in explaining my choices so they wouldn't be misunderstood, explaining my boundaries so they wouldn't feel rejected, explaining my exhaustion so it wouldn't be dismissed, explaining myself so thoroughly that there was nothing left unsaid, except the truth. Somewhere along the way, my life turned into a performance of coherence. I narrated myself in real time, adjusting my tone, softening my edges, making sure my inner world didn't disrupt anyone else's expectations. I became fluent in translation, turning discomfort into politeness, grief into productivity, confusion into competence, and I was praised for it. But praise has a way of quietly erasing you when it rewards self-abandonment. The beginning wasn't loud. It never is. It was an evening that looked like every other evening. The lights were low. The room was quiet. My phone rested face down on the table, vibrating occasionally with notifications I didn't have the energy to open. I remember sitting there, completely still, realizing that I had spent the entire day explaining myself to people who didn't really need to understand me, only to feel reassured by my effort. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not in anger, not in rebellion, in fatigue, a deep cellular tiredness that whispered a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. What if I stopped explaining? Not as a tactic, not as a boundary-setting exercise, just stopped. The thought felt almost dangerous. Silence had always been framed as absence, as withdrawal, as something you did when you were losing. Women like me weren't taught to go quiet. We were taught to clarify, to soothe, and to keep the emotional air breathable for everyone in the room. Silence felt like stepping off script, and yet something about that thought felt honest in a way words no longer did. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't frame it as growth. I simply paused. I let conversations end without adding one more sentence to make sure everyone felt okay. I didn't rush to explain why I needed space. I didn't fill the gaps when no one asked the next question. At first, the quiet felt empty, unsettling, like standing in a room after the noise has stopped and realizing how loud it was before. My nervous system searched for cues, someone else's mood, someone else's needs, something external to orient myself, but there was nothing to fix. And in that nothing, something else began to surface. I noticed how often I had been speaking from habit, not intention. How many of my words were shaped by anticipation rather than truth. I wasn't expressing myself. I was managing perception. Silence didn't make me disappear. It made me visible to myself. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without immediately preparing them for an audience. There was no need to defend them, no need to soften them, no need to justify their existence. I began to understand something that felt both obvious and revolutionary. I didn't owe my inner world an explanation. That realization didn't feel empowering in the loud, triumphant way we're taught to recognize as strength. It felt quiet, grounded, almost neutral, like standing on solid ground after years of adjusting your balance to someone else's movement. And here's the part no one warns you about. When you stop explaining, the world doesn't fall apart. It pauses. It recalibrates. Some people lean in. Others grow uncomfortable. A few drift away, confused by the absence of the emotional labor you used to provide. But underneath all of that, there's a deeper shift taking place, one that has nothing to do with them. You start to feel yourself again, not the version of you that performs competence, not the version that keeps things smooth, but the quieter self that exists before language, before justification, before the need to be understood. That's where this story begins, not with a breakdown, but with a refusal to keep narrating my life for the comfort of others. And if this opening already feels uncomfortably familiar, if something in you recognizes this moment, this pause, this quiet turning inward, then I invite you to stay. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel, not for motivation, not for answers, but for honesty, for depth, for stories that don't rush you toward a solution, but sit with you in the middle long enough for something real to emerge. If you've ever felt functional but hollow, capable but disconnected, composed but quietly lost, this space is for you. Because what comes next isn't about becoming someone new. It's about meeting the woman you stopped listening to the moment you learned how to explain yourself too well. Why silence feels uncomfortable for women like me. Silence never felt neutral to me. It felt charged, suspicious, as if the moment I stopped speaking, something would be assumed, something would be taken the wrong way, something would break. I wasn't afraid of being unheard. I was afraid of what my silence would mean to others. And women like me are not raised to trust quiet. We are raised to manage it. From an early age, I learned that silence created tension, and tension was my responsibility to resolve. If a room felt uncomfortable, I filled it. If someone looked confused, I clarified. If a relationship felt unsteady, I explained myself more carefully, more gently, more completely. I learned to speak not just to express, but to regulate, to smooth emotional edges before they could cut anyone. Silence, in that conditioning, becomes a threat. It signals withdrawal, disapproval, emotional distance. And women are taught, explicitly and implicitly, that emotional distance is dangerous. That connection must be maintained at all costs. That being misunderstood is worse than being exhausted. So I spoke. I spoke when I didn't yet understand what I felt. I spoke when I needed rest instead of resolution. I spoke to soften truths that didn't need softening. I spoke to protect others from discomfort that wasn't mine to carry. Over time, my voice became less about truth and more about translation. I learned how to say things in ways that would land gently, even when the truth itself was firm. I learned to preempt reactions, to answer questions before they were asked, to explain my intentions so thoroughly that no one would have to sit with uncertainty. And still, silence terrified me. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that my worth was tied to my responsiveness, my availability, my emotional fluency. Silence felt like dereliction of duty. When I began to speak less, my body reacted before my mind did. There was a tightening in my chest when I didn't reply right away, a flutter of anxiety when I let a conversation pause without rescuing it. My nervous system had been trained to associate quiet with rupture, with abandonment, with loss of connection. What I didn't understand at first was that discomfort doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes it means detox. Silence was uncomfortable because it disrupted a role I had perfected, the role of the emotional bridge, the translator, the one who made things make sense, the one who ensured continuity even when something wasn't aligned. Silence removed my familiar tools. It forced me to stay present without performing usefulness, and presence without performance felt exposed. There is a particular discomfort that arises when you stop doing what people unconsciously expect you to do, not because they demand it outright, but because the dynamic has been quietly built around your participation. When I went quiet, it wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable, and that was unsettling for me and for others. I began to see how often my speaking was actually a form of self-erasure, how often I interrupted my own internal process to accommodate someone else's comfort. Silence felt wrong because it required me to tolerate not being immediately understood. It required me to sit with the possibility that someone might misinterpret me and to resist correcting them. That resistance was the hardest part, because silence doesn't give you control. It removes it. When I spoke, I could guide perception. I could soften impact. I could manage outcomes. Silence stripped all of that away, and it asked me to trust something I had never practiced trusting before, my own internal alignment, without external confirmation. I noticed how quickly my mind would try to fill the quiet with stories. They think I'm upset. They think I'm distant. They think I don't care. Silence created a vacuum where projection rushed in, and for a long time I believed those projections were warnings. But slowly, something else became clear. The discomfort wasn't coming from silence itself. It was coming from the absence of my usual coping mechanism. I had used words to regulate anxiety, to maintain belonging, to avoid the unease of not knowing how I was being received. Silence forced me to sit with ambiguity. And ambiguity, for women conditioned to be emotionally precise and relationally attuned, can feel unbearable. Yet within that unbearable space, when something essential began to happen, I started to notice the difference between silence chosen from fear and silence chosen from awareness. Fear-based silence collapses inward. It withholds, sulks, avoids. Awareness-based silence stands upright. It listens. It observes. It does not rush to resolve what does not belong to it. This distinction changed how I experienced my own quiet. I wasn't going silent to punish anyone. I wasn't withdrawing love or connection. I was simply no longer rushing to make things emotionally legible before I understood them myself. And that unsettled people. Some filled the space with more words. Some asked if everything was okay. Some interpreted my quiet as disapproval, and in those moments the old impulse rose fast, to reassure, to explain, to restore equilibrium. But I didn't. I stayed. And staying revealed something I had never fully seen before. Not all discomfort is a problem to solve. Some discomfort is an initiation, a threshold you cross when you stop outsourcing your emotional regulation. Silence was uncomfortable because it asked me to stop performing coherence, to allow myself to be unfinished, to be unclear, to not immediately wrap my inner experience in language designed to make it digestible. Women like me are praised for emotional articulation, for being good communicators, but rarely are we taught that constant articulation can become a form of self-surveillance, that always explaining yourself can be a way of staying one step removed from actually feeling. Silence took that buffer away. In the quiet, feelings rose without narrative, without justification, without explanation, and I had to meet them directly. That was far more confronting than any conversation I had ever had, but it was also grounding. I began to understand that silence wasn't taking something away from me. It was giving something back, space, time, ownership over my inner rhythm. It was asking me to trust that connection doesn't always require commentary, that some truths don't need witnesses to be real. Silence felt uncomfortable because it challenged everything I had learned about being a good woman, a good partner, a good presence in the world. It asked me to believe that my value didn't disappear when my voice paused. And learning that didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, through moments of restraint, through unanswered messages that didn't end relationships, through pauses in conversations that didn't collapse intimacy, and through the quiet realization that nothing terrible happened when I stopped filling every space. What happened instead was subtler. I began to feel myself standing on my own ground, not louder, not harder, just steadier. And that steadiness, though unfamiliar, felt like the beginning of something I had never been taught to want, a relationship with myself that didn't require constant explanation to survive. The day I realized my energy was not infinite, there was a day when nothing dramatic happened, and yet something irreversible clicked into place. No argument, no diagnosis, no goodbye. Just a moment so ordinary that I almost dismissed it, until I couldn't. It was late afternoon in Santa Monica, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it is. I had just left a long meeting, one of those conversations that requires your full attention but gives nothing back. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was empty in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. What startled me wasn't the exhaustion itself. It was the realization that this feeling had become familiar. I'd been telling myself a quiet lie for years, that as long as I managed my time well enough, stayed organized enough, rested occasionally, I could keep going indefinitely. That energy was something to be optimized, scheduled, recovered. I treated it like a resource that could always be replenished if I just tried harder. But sitting there, unable to turn the key in the ignition, I understood something I had been avoiding. My energy was not just tired, it was overdrawn. And not because of work, not because of age, not because life was unusually demanding. It was because I had been spending energy in places that never intended to return it. That realization didn't come as a sentence. It came as a question, quiet but persistent. Where is my energy actually going? I had never asked that before with any real honesty. I knew where my time went. I knew where my obligations lived. But energy was different. Energy leaked in subtler ways, through conversations that left me strangely tense, through emotional maintenance that went unnoticed, through the constant low-level vigilance of anticipating reactions, smoothing moments, staying one step ahead of disappointment. I began replaying my days, not in hours, but in exchanges. I noticed how often I left interactions feeling slightly diminished, as if a small tax had been taken without my consent. How many of my conversations required me to be alert, accommodating, emotionally available, even when nothing was truly being shared. There was a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. I gave energy to avoid discomfort. I gave energy to keep things nice. I gave energy to prevent misunderstandings that might never have happened. I gave energy to people who were accustomed to receiving it, not to reciprocating it. And the most unsettling part was this. I did it willingly, automatically, without questioning whether it was necessary. I had confused being responsible with being endlessly accessible. That afternoon, the thought landed fully for the first time. Attention is currency, and I had been spending mine without intention. I treated my emotional presence as something owed, something expected, something that didn't require discernment. No wonder I felt depleted. I was living as if my inner resources had no limits. I drove home slowly, not out of caution, but because I didn't feel rushed anymore. Something in me had shifted from urgency to awareness. I wasn't trying to solve anything. I was noticing, and noticing was exhausting in a different way. because it required honesty. At home, the quiet felt different than it had before. Not comforting, not heavy, just revealing. I could see how much of my energy had been scattered across other people's needs, moods, expectations, many of which were never explicitly asked of me, only silently assumed. I began to understand that exhaustion isn't always a sign of doing too much. Sometimes it's a sign of giving too freely to the wrong places. Energy isn't just physical, it's emotional, psychological, nervous. And when it's spent without intention, it drains in ways that are hard to name. You don't collapse, you erode. What made this realization so confronting was that no one had taken my energy by force. I had offered it, repeatedly, in the name of being kind, being capable, being the one who could handle it. But handling everything came at a cost I had never fully calculated. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction became clearer. I noticed how my body responded before my mind did, how certain conversations tightened my chest, how certain requests made my shoulders rise before I even answered. My body had been keeping the ledger long before I was willing to look at the numbers. And the numbers didn't lie. I had been operating as if my energy existed to be spent rather than protected. As if rest was something to earn instead of something to honor. As if saying yes by default was a moral virtue rather than a habit. That day didn't make me angry at anyone. It made me quiet with myself. Quiet enough to admit that I had been afraid of what would happen if I stopped giving so much. Afraid relationships would weaken. Afraid I would seem less generous. Afraid I would disappoint people who had grown used to my constant availability. But beneath that fear was something steadier, a recognition that continuing this way was not sustainable. This wasn't about boundaries yet. It wasn't about saying no. It was about awareness, about understanding that energy, once spent, shapes the quality of your inner life. And I didn't like the life my spending habits were creating. I wasn't burnt out from doing too much, and I was worn down from doing too much unconsciously. That day marked the beginning of a new discipline. Not productivity, not self-improvement, but discernment. I didn't need to overhaul my life. I needed to stop leaking. And the first step wasn't action. It was observation. I started asking the question quietly, without judgment, again and again. Is this worth my energy? Not is it right or kind or expected, but is it aligned with the life I'm actually living now? Sometimes the answer surprised me. Sometimes it disappointed me. But it was always clarifying. That afternoon in Santa Monica didn't change my circumstances. It changed my orientation. I stopped assuming I had endless reserves. I stopped confusing endurance with strength. And in doing so, I began to treat my energy not as something to prove with, but as something to live from. And that understanding didn't make my life easier overnight, but it made it truer. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough to begin with. When I turn inward, not to escape, but to anchor. Turning inward didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a decision I announced to myself in a moment of clarity. It unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, in the quiet spaces left behind after I stopped scattering my energy outward. I didn't turn inward to disappear from the world. I turned inward because I was tired of floating inside it. For most of my life, my attention had lived outside my body. I tracked other people's reactions more closely than my own sensations. I knew when a room shifted before I knew when I was overwhelmed. I sensed discomfort in others, faster than I recognized it in myself. And turning inward meant reversing that orientation. And that reversal felt unnatural at first, like writing with my non-dominant hand. The first thing I noticed wasn't insight. It was restlessness. When I stopped reaching for external input, No conversations to manage, no emotional threads to follow, no problems to preempt. My mind fidgeted. It wanted something to do, something to fix. Turning inward revealed how much of my outward focus had been a form of distraction, not from life, but from myself. I began in small, almost insignificant ways. I walked without trying to turn the moment into something useful. No podcasts, no mental rehearsals, just the sound of my steps on the pavement, the rhythm of my breath, the mild discomfort of being alone with my thoughts. I sat with my coffee without reaching for my phone. I let silence stretch without filling it. These weren't rituals. They were interruptions of habit. At first, my inner world felt surprisingly noisy. Thoughts rose without order. Old conversations replayed themselves. Unfinished feelings demanded attention. Turning inward didn't bring immediate calm. It brought contact. And contact, I learned, is not the same as comfort. There was a temptation to label this process as retreat, to frame it as withdrawal or avoidance. But it wasn't about escaping responsibility or detaching from reality. It was about anchoring, about finding a place inside myself that didn't sway with every external movement. I had been living like a buoy, responsive to every wave. Turning inward allowed me to touch the ocean floor. Anchoring required me to slow down in ways that felt almost countercultural, and I paused before responding, not to craft better answers, but to notice whether a response was even necessary. I checked my body before agreeing to things. I let moments pass without commentary. This wasn't self-discipline. It was self-attunement. What surprised me most was how much information my body carried once I started listening. Subtle cues I had ignored for years began to speak clearly. A tightening in my chest when something wasn't aligned. A sense of expansion when it was. Fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with emotional overextension. Turning inward taught me that clarity doesn't always arrive as a thought. Sometimes it arrives as a sensation. There was grief in this process, too. Grief for how long I had lived disconnected from myself. Grief for the parts of me that learned to stay alert rather than grounded. I had to sit with the realization that my constant outward focus wasn't just generosity, it was survival. It had once protected me. Acknowledging that softened the shame. I wasn't broken. I was adapted. Anchoring meant honoring that adaptation without letting it run my life anymore. As I stayed with myself, something subtle began to change in how I experienced time. Moments felt less rushed. Decisions felt less reactive. I wasn't trying to optimize my life. I was inhabiting it. There is a difference. One seeks improvement. The other seeks presence. Turning inward also revealed how much of my identity had been shaped around usefulness. I was comfortable when I was needed, uncertain when I wasn't. Sitting with myself without performing a role felt exposed. Who was I if I wasn't responding, anticipating, supporting? The question didn't demand an answer. It asked for patience. I learned that anchoring doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean closing yourself off from connection. It means you stop using connection to stabilize yourself. When you're anchored, relationships become exchanges rather than lifelines. You can engage without losing your center. You can listen without absorbing. You can care without carrying. This shift didn't make me less compassionate. It made my compassion cleaner. I no longer rushed in to manage emotions that weren't mine. I allowed others the dignity of their own experiences. That, too, was a form of respect, both for them and for myself. There were moments when turning inward felt lonely, not because I was alone, but because I was no longer buffering myself with noise. Loneliness surfaced not as a problem to solve, but as a signal, a reminder of how much companionship I had once sought externally without offering it internally. Learning to keep myself company was not glamorous. It was necessary. Over time, the inward turn became less effortful. I didn't have to force myself to slow down. My nervous system began to recognize the safety of stillness. The constant scanning softened. I trusted myself to handle what arose without preemptive action. Anchoring changed how I moved through the world. I wasn't rushing to arrive somewhere else. I was standing where I was. When I spoke, it was from a place of alignment rather than urgency. When I was silent, it wasn't empty. It was inhabited. Turning inward didn't shrink my life. It gave it weight, substance, a sense of gravity that had been missing when I was always orienting myself around others. I hadn't stepped away from life. I had stepped into myself. And from that place, everything I engaged with felt more grounded, less performative, more true. That was when I began to understand that anchoring isn't something you achieve once and carry forever. It's a practice, a return, a willingness to come back to yourself again and again, especially when the world pulls at you. I didn't turn inward to escape what was happening around me. I turned inward so I could finally stand still within it. And that stillness became the ground I didn't know I had been missing. The power shift. No one warned me about what would happen when I stopped filling the space. I thought the change would be internal, quieter thoughts, calmer days, and maybe a little more clarity. I didn't expect the shift to ripple outward so quickly or so visibly. I didn't expect other people to feel it before I fully understood it myself. At first, nothing looked different. I was still showing up, still present, still listening. But I wasn't rushing to respond anymore. I wasn't translating my pauses into reassurance. I wasn't volunteering explanations before they were asked for. I let conversations end where they naturally ended instead of extending them to feel complete. And that's when the power shifted. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way you could point to and name. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a change in air pressure. People leaned forward more when I spoke. Some filled the silence quickly, nervously. Others asked questions they'd never asked before. And a few grew strangely unsettled, as if something familiar had gone missing and they didn't know why. I hadn't taken anything away from them. I had just stopped giving something they'd grown accustomed to receiving without noticing. That's the part no one prepares you for. When you change quietly, the world doesn't always applaud. Sometimes it resists. Sometimes it tests the edges of your stillness to see if you'll return to your old role. And I felt those tests immediately. There were moments when someone would say, "You're quiet today," not with curiosity, but with expectation, as if my silence required justification. My instinct, honed over decades, was to respond with an explanation, to reassure, to soften whatever discomfort my quiet had created. But I didn't. I stayed where I was, and in that staying, and I learned something unsettling and liberating at the same time. Much of the influence I had once exerted in relationships came from my willingness to overextend. When I stopped overfunctioning, the dynamic had to recalibrate. And recalibration is uncomfortable for anyone who benefited from the imbalance. This wasn't about control. I wasn't withholding information or affection to gain leverage. The power shift happened because I removed myself from the constant negotiation. I stopped managing outcomes. I stopped making sure everyone felt okay before I checked in with myself. Power, I realized, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as absence, as restraint, as the refusal to rush in and stabilize a moment that isn't yours to stabilize. Some people responded with curiosity. They slowed down. They listened differently. and our conversations became more intentional, less performative. Others responded with subtle pressure, more questions, more probing, more attempts to pull me back into my familiar role, and a few simply drifted away, uninterested in a version of me that didn't offer emotional labor on demand. That was hard to watch, not because I missed the dynamics themselves, but because I had to confront the truth of them. I had to see which connections were sustained by mutual presence and which were sustained by my constant availability. The power shift wasn't about me becoming stronger in the way strength is usually framed. It was about me becoming less available for dynamics that required my self-erasure to function. I noticed how often silence invited honesty from others and from myself, without my usual verbal cushioning. People revealed how they related to uncertainty, to boundaries, to not being immediately accommodated. Some rose to the moment, others recoiled. None of it was personal, but all of it was informative. What surprised me most was how little effort the shift required. I wasn't asserting dominance. I wasn't setting ultimatums. I wasn't making declarations. I was simply occupying my own space without apology, and that was enough to change the geometry of every interaction. There were moments when the old fear surfaced, the fear of being misunderstood, of being seen as cold or distant. I felt the temptation to explain myself, rush in like muscle memory, but I had learned enough by then to recognize that urge for what it was, an attempt to regain control through accommodation. Letting go of that control felt risky. And silence doesn't give you the last word. It gives you exposure. It allows others to project, to interpret, to react without correction. And choosing not to intervene in that process required trust. Trust that my integrity didn't depend on constant clarification. The more I trusted that, the steadier I became. Something else happened that I didn't anticipate. I began to feel my own authority differently. Not authority over others, but over my time, my attention, my inner state. I didn't feel the same urgency to be included, to be consulted, to be emotionally central. I was still connected, but no longer entangled. That distinction changed everything. When I spoke, people listened. Not because I spoke less as a strategy, but because my words were no longer diluted by overuse. When I chose silence, it carried weight, not as a weapon, but as a signal. I am here, and I am not scrambling. I also began to notice how much energy I had previously spent trying to be agreeable, how often I had confused being liked with being aligned. The power shift stripped that illusion away. Alignment felt quieter than approval, but infinitely more grounding. There was grief in this phase, too. Grief for relationships that couldn't survive the change. Grief for the version of myself that believed she had to earn respect by explaining herself endlessly. But that grief was clean. It didn't drag me backward. It clarified what mattered. What no one tells you is that when you stop over-explaining, you give other people the opportunity to step up or to step out. Silence creates a mirror, and it shows who is willing to meet you where you are and who only knew how to relate to you when you were bending. I didn't become untouchable. I became anchored, and anchoring alters everything around you. The power shift wasn't something I chased. It emerged naturally the moment I stopped performing emotional availability as proof of my worth. I didn't need to demand respect. I simply stopped abandoning myself, and in that quiet recalibration, something irreversible took place. I understood deeply and without drama that my presence was no longer something to be negotiated. It was something to be felt, and that changed the way the world responded to me, without me ever having to ask it to. Emotional sovereignty. When I stopped letting others set my inner weather for a long time, Oh, I believed that being emotionally intelligent meant being emotionally responsive. I thought awareness was measured by how quickly I could sense a shift in someone else's mood and adjust myself accordingly. I mistook attunement for responsibility. If someone was tense, I tightened. If someone was distant, I leaned in. If someone was upset, my inner weather changed instantly, as if their emotional climate had authority over my internal state. I didn't realize how deeply I had outsourced my emotional sovereignty. It showed up in small, everyday ways. A critical tone could derail my entire morning. An unanswered message could follow me for hours. Someone else's disappointment could override my own clarity. I was living in a constant state of emotional readiness, scanning for cues, preparing responses, bracing for impact. And I wasn't fragile, but I was permeable. I told myself this was empathy, that this was what it meant to care. But care that cost you your center isn't care. It's overexposure. The shift didn't come from a single insight. It came from exhaustion, from noticing how often I felt hijacked by emotions that weren't mine to carry, from recognizing that I could understand someone deeply and still not need to absorb their experience as my own. That distinction changed how I related to everything. Emotional sovereignty didn't make me detached. It made me differentiated. I began to notice the space between what I felt and what I did. For the first time, that space didn't terrify me. It grounded me. I realized I could feel disappointment without reacting defensively. I could feel anger without needing to discharge it immediately. I could feel sadness without letting it dictate my decisions. Before, emotions had functioned like commands. Now, they became information. This wasn't about suppression. I didn't push feelings away or pretend they weren't there. I let them rise fully, but I stopped letting them steer. I learned that emotions want acknowledgement, not obedience. When I gave them that, they softened. When I didn't, they escalated. Breath became a quiet ally in this process, not as a technique, but as a pause, a return to the body when the mind wanted to run ahead. I noticed how one slow breath could interrupt a familiar pattern, how it could create just enough distance between stimulus and response to allow choice back into the room. Choice was the key. When someone spoke sharply, I no longer mirrored their edge. When a conversation veered toward conflict, and I didn't rush to fix it, I stayed present without surrendering my internal equilibrium. This didn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes it felt exposed, but it felt true. What surprised me most was how emotional sovereignty altered my relationships without me naming it. People sensed the change, not consciously perhaps, but viscerally. My steadiness didn't escalate tension. It diffused it, or in some cases revealed it. I could now see which dynamics thrived on emotional reactivity and which could hold calm without collapsing. There were moments when I wanted to revert, when old patterns called out seductively, react now, explain now, defend now. Emotional sovereignty asked something harder of me: restraint without withdrawal, presence without entanglement, care without collapse. And I began to understand that not every feeling deserves expression in the moment it arises. Some feelings need space before they can speak clearly, and some don't need to be spoken at all to be honored. This shift changed how I handled conflict. I no longer needed to win or be right to feel secure. I could listen without self-abandonment. I could speak without aggression. I could step away without resentment. My nervous system learned that safety didn't depend on control. That was revolutionary. I also saw how often emotional volatility had been mistaken for passion, how intensity had been confused with depth. Emotional sovereignty didn't flatten my experience. It refined it. Feelings became more nuanced, reactions less dramatic, truth more accessible. I trusted myself more. Oh, I stopped second-guessing my perceptions because I wasn't constantly overriding them to accommodate others. I stopped crowdsourcing my worth through emotional feedback. I no longer needed someone else's approval to stabilize my inner state. This didn't make me immune to hurt. It made me resilient to it. There is a difference. Being emotionally sovereign means I can be affected without being overtaken. I can be moved without being derailed. I can care deeply without losing my footing. It means my inner weather no longer shifts with every external pressure system. I am still human. I still feel, but I no longer live at the mercy of every passing storm. What emerged in that steadiness was something I hadn't expected. Freedom. Not the loud performative kind, the quiet kind. And the kind that comes from knowing that no one else holds the keys to your inner world. I didn't harden. I clarified. Emotional sovereignty didn't make me less loving. It made my love less anxious, less conditional, less transactional. I could give without keeping score. I could receive without clinging. I could stand in my emotions without asking someone else what they meant. This way of being didn't isolate me. It anchored me. And from that anchor, I could finally meet others as myself, not as a reflection of their moods, not as a regulator of their emotions, not as a mirror designed to make them feel steady. I met them as someone who belonged first to herself. That, I learned, is what emotional sovereignty really is. Not control, not detachment, but authorship. The ability to feel fully and still choose who I am in the presence of those feelings. And once that authorship returned to me, my inner world stopped feeling like a weather report written by someone else. It became home. The body knows. Before the mind does for years, I trusted my thoughts more than my body. I believed understanding came from analysis, from naming things correctly, from thinking my way through discomfort. My body, I assumed, would catch up eventually. I treated it like a vehicle, useful, reliable, but secondary, something to manage rather than listen to. I didn't realize how much wisdom I was ignoring. The body speaks quietly. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't demand attention in words. And because of that, I learned to overlook it. I learned to push past tension, override fatigue, dismiss subtle signals in favor of what seemed reasonable, expected, or polite. My mind was fluent in logic. My body spoke in sensation, and I had been trained to privilege one over the other. The first sign wasn't pain. It was a pattern. A tightness in my chest during certain conversations, a shallow breath when I agreed to things too quickly, a heaviness in my shoulders that appeared before I admitted I was carrying too much. These sensations didn't arrive as emergencies. They arrived as whispers, and for a long time I treated them as background noise. What changed wasn't a diagnosis or a breakdown. It was a tension. As I grew quieter internally, as I stopped reacting so quickly, I began to notice what my body had been saying all along. It reacted faster than my mind ever could. Before I formed an opinion, and my body had already registered alignment or resistance. Before I explained a feeling, my body had already responded to the truth of it. There was humility in that realization. I began to understand that the body doesn't lie, but it also doesn't persuade. It offers information without commentary. It doesn't care if the information is inconvenient. It doesn't adjust itself to social expectations. It simply reports what is. Listening required me to slow down in ways that felt almost radical. I had to pause long enough to notice my breath, to feel my feet on the ground, to register how my posture changed depending on who I was with and what I was agreeing to. These weren't techniques. They were acts of presence. The more I listened, the clearer the language became. Expansion meant yes. Constriction meant pause. Numbness meant something had been bypassed. Tension meant I was overriding myself. This awareness didn't make decisions easier at first. It made them more honest, and honesty has weight. There were moments when my body signaled discomfort long before my mind was ready to accept it. Moments when logic argued for accommodation while my body quietly resisted. In the past, I would have dismissed that resistance as fear or inconvenience. Now, I stayed with it. Not to dramatize it, but to understand it. Staying changed everything. I began to see how often I had lived from the neck up, how often I had spoken from habit rather than embodiment, how many of my words carried urgency because my body wasn't grounded enough to support them. When I slowed my breath, my voice changed. When I stood differently, conversations shifted. And not because I was trying to influence anything, but because alignment has a presence of its own. I didn't need to assert myself more. I needed to inhabit myself more. There is a kind of authority that comes from being settled in your body. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek attention. It simply alters the field. People feel it before they understand it. It shows up in how you move, how you sit, how you listen without leaning forward or pulling away. I noticed that when my body was grounded, I didn't rush to speak. Silence felt natural rather than forced. My stillness wasn't empty, it was full, and that fullness changed how others responded. They slowed down. They chose their words more carefully, or they revealed their impatience. Either way, clarity emerged. The body also taught me something uncomfortable. How often I had overridden my own limits in the name of being agreeable. My fatigue wasn't a failure of resilience. It was a message. My tension wasn't weakness. It was information. My body had been keeping score long after my mind insisted everything was fine. Listening meant accepting responsibility, not blame but authorship. I couldn't unknow what my body was telling me. I couldn't return to decisions made purely from obligation or momentum. Once sensation entered the conversation, pretense lost its grip. I had to choose whether to honor what I felt or continue explaining it away. This wasn't about becoming hyper-focused on the body or turning inward obsessively. It was about integration, about letting mind and body collaborate instead of compete. When they aligned, my decisions felt quieter, less conflicted, less dramatic. I didn't feel empowered. I felt coherent. There is a difference between confidence and coherence. Confidence can be projected. Coherence is felt. One can be performed. The other cannot. And coherence begins in the body. As I learned to listen, I also learned to trust the pauses, the moments when my body needed time before my mind could articulate why. I stopped demanding immediate clarity from myself. I allowed understanding to arrive through sensation rather than explanation. This patience softened me. I moved more slowly, not because I lacked energy, but because I no longer needed to outrun myself. I stood my ground without bracing. I sat in conversations without collapsing inward or pushing outward. I was present in my body, and that presence became my reference point. And the body didn't give me answers in sentences. It gave me orientation. It told me when I was aligned and when I wasn't, when I was safe and when I was overreaching, when something belonged to me and when it didn't. I had spent years trying to think my way into clarity. What I learned instead was that clarity often begins as a feeling, a subtle shift, a quiet knowing that doesn't need justification. The body knew before the mind did, and once I learned to listen, I stopped needing to convince myself of things I already felt. I didn't become louder. I became more present, and presence I discovered, carries its own unmistakable truth. Silence, as a filter, not a wall slants, was never meant to be a wall for me. I didn't use it to shut people out or to punish them for misunderstanding me. But that's how it was often perceived at first. When I stopped explaining, stopped clarifying, stopped filling the space with reassurance, some assumed I had hardened, that I was withdrawing, that I was closing myself off. What they didn't see was that silence wasn't something I put up between us. It was something I stood inside. For most of my life, I had used words as bridges. I believed connection depended on constant exchange, on making myself legible at all times. If something felt off, I talked it through. If there was tension, I addressed it. If someone pulled away, I leaned forward with language, trying to restore equilibrium. Silence felt like abandonment, mine or theirs. But when I finally stopped rushing to fill every gap, something unexpected happened. The silence didn't sever connection. It clarified it. I began to see silence as a filter rather than a barrier, a way of allowing what was real to surface without interference. When I stopped intervening, dynamics revealed themselves. Patterns that had been blurred by my constant engagement became visible, not because I exposed them, but because I no longer distracted from them. Silence removes the scaffolding, and without scaffolding, structures either stand on their own or they don't. At first, this was uncomfortable. I watched conversations unfold without my usual guidance. I let misunderstandings linger instead of rushing to correct them. I allowed people to sit with their own reactions rather than absorbing or neutralizing them. This wasn't neglect. It was restraint, and restraint felt radical. There were moments when the urge to speak rose sharply, moments when I could feel the familiar pull to smooth things over and to rescue connection from uncertainty. Silence demanded that I tolerate not knowing how I was being perceived, that I allow others to form their own conclusions without my input. That kind of trust doesn't come easily, but over time, I noticed what silence made possible. When I stopped explaining myself, people showed me how they responded to boundaries that weren't announced, only embodied. Some respected the quiet instinctively. They slowed down. They asked better questions. They listened more carefully when I did speak. Others reacted differently. They filled the silence with assumptions, or pressure, or withdrawal. And while that hurt at times, it also told the truth. Silence revealed who needed constant access to me in order to feel secure, and who could meet me without demanding emotional availability on demand. And this is what I mean when I say silence is a filter. It doesn't block connection. It refines it. I didn't have to interrogate anyone. I didn't have to test loyalty or provoke clarity. I simply stepped back and observed, and in that observation, things became unmistakably clear. Who leaned in without being invited? Who only engaged when I carried the emotional weight? Who respected my pace, and who resented it? Silence stripped away projection. It stopped me from confusing potential with reality. When I wasn't actively maintaining a dynamic, I could finally see what was actually there. This was especially true in moments of conflict. In the past, conflict meant engagement, explanation, defense. I believed resolution required articulation, but silence taught me something different. Sometimes the most honest response isn't an argument. It's a pause, a refusal to escalate, a choice not to perform emotional labor for a situation that thrives on it. In those pauses, intentions surfaced. People often reveal more in silence than they ever do in conversation. Without your immediate response, they show you how they handle uncertainty, discomfort, and loss of control. Silence gives others space to be themselves, without your guidance, without your emotional buffering, and it gives you space to see them clearly. I learned that silence doesn't have to be dramatic to be decisive. It doesn't need to announce boundaries to enforce them. When I stopped over-explaining, I stopped negotiating my presence. I didn't disappear. I simply became less accessible to dynamics that required my constant participation to survive. When that distinction mattered, there's a difference between withdrawing out of resentment and stepping back out of clarity. One is reactive, the other is intentional. My silence wasn't fueled by anger or avoidance. It was fueled by alignment. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was trying to hear myself, and hearing myself required quiet. Silence also changed how I related to endings. When certain connections faded, I didn't chase closure the way I used to. I didn't need everything to be resolved verbally to be resolved internally. I allowed distance to do its work. I let time and space reveal what words never could. This wasn't passive, it was disciplined. I stopped treating every unanswered question as a problem. Not every silence needs interpretation. Not every gap needs filling. When some things become clear only when you stop interfering with them. That was one of the hardest lessons for me. I had been conditioned to believe that effort equaled care, that staying engaged proved commitment. Silence challenged that belief. It asked me to consider that care could also look like restraint, that respect could look like space, and that I didn't need to be everywhere to be present. As silence filtered my relationships, my world grew quieter, but not emptier. Fewer interactions demanded my energy, but those that remained felt steadier, more grounded, less performative. I wasn't surrounded by people who needed constant reassurance. I was surrounded by those who could stand on their own. That shift didn't make me lonely. It made me honest. I began to trust silence as an ally. See, a way of letting life organize itself without my constant intervention. A way of allowing truth to surface at its own pace. A way of honoring my energy without turning it into a negotiation. Silence didn't isolate me. It protected what was real. I stopped seeing quiet as something to fear or explain away. I saw it as a space where alignment could breathe, where I could observe without absorbing, where I could remain open without being overextended. A wall keeps things out. A filter lets the right things through. Silence, when chosen consciously, does the latter. It doesn't shut the world down, it sorts it. And once I understood that, I stopped apologizing for my quiet. I trusted it. Because in that quiet, everything unnecessary began to fall away, and what remained finally had room to be true. Done when things start falling into place, quietly. Nothing snapped into place all at once. There was no moment where I could point to my life and say, this is it. This is where everything changed. If anything, the change was so quiet that I almost missed it. It didn't announce itself. It didn't ask for recognition. It unfolded slowly, in the background, while I was busy living. That's how I knew it was real. The first thing I noticed wasn't happiness. It was the absence of a certain kind of tension. The low-grade anxiety that used to follow me through my days, like background noise I had learned to tolerate, began to fade, not completely, but enough that I could finally hear myself think without strain. I wasn't calmer because my life had become easier. I was calmer because I had stopped fighting reality. I stopped pushing against what was already telling me where it wanted to go. Things didn't fall into place because I forced them to. They fell into place because I stopped interfering. My decisions began to feel less dramatic. I no longer stood at crossroads trying to calculate the perfect outcome, weighing everyone else's expectations against my own. Choices emerged quietly, almost naturally, once I stopped negotiating with fear. I didn't always feel confident, but I felt clear, and clarity turned out to be far more sustaining than confidence ever was. Relationships shifted in ways I couldn't have planned. Some grew quieter, but stronger. Conversations became more spacious. I listened without scanning for what to say next. I spoke without bracing for impact. There was less urgency to be understood immediately. I trusted that what mattered would land in time. Other relationships faded, not abruptly, not painfully, but unmistakably. Without my constant energy holding them together, they simply loosened and fell away. That used to terrify me. Now it felt honest. I wasn't losing people. I was losing dynamics that required me to be someone I no longer was. What surprised me most was how little effort this required. I wasn't fixing anything. I wasn't improving myself. I was aligning, and alignment has a gravity of its own. My days became simpler, though not smaller. I didn't fill every moment. I left space between things, space to breathe, space to notice, space to rest without explaining why I needed it. I began to trust that nothing important would pass me by if I slowed down. What belonged to me would find me at my pace. I stopped chasing closure, and I let unanswered questions remain unanswered. And somehow, that gave me more peace than any explanation ever had. I realized that understanding doesn't always come through conversation. Sometimes it arrives through distance, through time, through watching what unfolds when you're no longer managing it. There was a quiet confidence that emerged, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that steadies you from the inside. I no longer felt the need to check in constantly with how I was being perceived. I wasn't indifferent. I was grounded. My sense of self stopped wobbling every time someone reacted unexpectedly. Even my mistakes felt different. I no longer spiraled into self-correction or over-analysis. I noticed, adjusted, and moved on. I trusted my ability to respond wisely when something went wrong, instead of trying to prevent everything from going wrong in the first place. That trust was new. My energy felt more contained, less scattered. I wasn't exhausted in the same way anymore. I still got tired, but not hollow, not drained by things that weren't mine to carry. I could tell the difference now, and that difference mattered. There were moments of doubt, of course. Quiet doesn't mean easy. There were days when I wondered if I was doing enough, if I was missing something, if this slower, more restrained way of living would cost me opportunities. But every time I checked in with myself, the answer came back steady. This is right, not exciting, not impressive. Right. I began to notice how life responded when I stopped chasing it. Invitations arrived without effort, and conversations deepened without pushing. Opportunities appeared that matched my pace instead of demanding I contort myself to fit them. I wasn't manifesting anything. I was available to what aligned. And when something didn't align, I felt it immediately. There was no internal debate, no rationalizing, just a quiet no that didn't need defense. That, more than anything, told me I was on solid ground. The world around me didn't transform. I did. And that changed my relationship to everything. I wasn't waiting for clarity anymore. I was living from it. I wasn't hoping things would settle. They were settling because I had. I learned that falling into place doesn't look like perfection. It looks like coherence, fewer contradictions, less self-betrayal, a growing sense that your inner life and outer life are no longer at odds. I didn't become happier in a dramatic way. I became steadier, and steadiness has its own quiet joy, the kind that doesn't spike and crash, the kind that stays with you when nothing particularly good or bad is happening. I stopped needing proof that I was on the right path. The path felt right under my feet. That's the thing no one tells you. When things truly begin to fall into place, there's no applause, no rush, no finish line, just a subtle sense of relief, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years without realizing it. I wasn't fixing my life anymore. I was inhabiting it. And in that inhabiting, things didn't become perfect. They became honest, manageable, real, quietly. Without drama, without force, my life began to reflect the stillness I had chosen inside. That was how I knew, and everything that mattered was already finding its way to me, not because I was chasing it, but because I had finally stopped running away from myself. You're not disappearing. You're returning. For a long time, I thought. Becoming quieter meant becoming smaller. I believed that if I stopped explaining, stopped reacting, stopped offering myself so readily, I would slowly fade from relevance, that I would lose connection, that I would be forgotten. Everything in me had been conditioned to equate visibility with value. But what I learned, slowly, without drama, is that I wasn't disappearing at all. I was returning to a version of myself that existed before I learned how to perform coherence, before I learned how to stay palatable, before I learned how to smooth my edges so others wouldn't feel unsettled by my truth. And I wasn't shedding my life. I was shedding the noise I had wrapped around it. There is a particular fear that comes when you stop managing how you're perceived. A fear that says, if I don't keep showing who I am, people won't know me anymore. What that fear doesn't account for is how much of what people knew was shaped by effort, not essence, by repetition, not reality. When I stopped performing myself, something unexpected happened. I felt closer to who I actually was than I had in years. Not the version of me that could handle everything, not the version that stayed composed no matter what, but the quieter self that didn't need to prove her strength through endurance. The self that didn't need constant affirmation to stay upright. The self that could exist without narration. I used to believe that withdrawal was a kind of failure. That stepping back meant giving up ground. But what I discovered was the opposite. Stepping back gave me ground, solid ground, the kind that doesn't shift every time someone else changes direction. I didn't withdraw from life. I withdrew from self-abandonment. That distinction matters. I still care. I still love. I still show up. But I do it from a place that is anchored rather than reactive. I no longer rush to fill silence with reassurance. I no longer chase understanding to feel safe. I no longer negotiate my presence as if it were conditional. I am here. And that is enough. Returning to myself didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet and almost ordinary, like walking back into a room I had left years ago and finding it unchanged, waiting. The furniture was familiar. The air felt steady. Nothing dramatic had happened there. I had just been gone, and being gone had cost me more than I realized. I had spent years trying to become someone others could rely on without realizing I had become someone I couldn't rely on myself. My instincts were buried under accommodation. My needs were filtered through expectations. My voice was shaped by what I thought would be received well. Returning meant undoing that slowly, gently, without blame. It meant trusting myself again, not in a grand, confident way, but in small, consistent ways. Trusting that I could feel something without explaining it immediately. Trusting that I could pause without losing momentum. Trusting that I could say less and still be understood by the people who were meant to understand me. And for those who didn't, who required constant access, constant reassurance, and a constant effort, I let the distance speak, not as punishment, as truth. There's a grief that comes with this return, grief for how long I lived disconnected from myself, grief for the energy I spent trying to be legible instead of being real, grief for the version of me who believed she had to earn her place by staying agreeable. But there is also relief. Relief in no longer carrying what doesn't belong to me. Relief in not having to explain why I am quieter now. Relief in knowing that my worth doesn't depend on how much space I take up audibly. I didn't become invisible. I became clear, and clarity changes everything. When you return to yourself, you stop chasing alignment. You embody it. Your decisions feel less frantic. Your relationships feel less performative. Your days feel less crowded, even when they're full. There is a steadiness beneath the surface that doesn't need to be advertised. This steadiness doesn't protect you from pain. It protects you from confusion. I still encounter uncertainty. I still face moments of doubt. But I face them as myself, not as a version of me trying to manage outcomes or impressions. I no longer rush to resolve what needs time. I no longer fear quiet as a sign of loss. Silence has become a place I can stand. Returning to myself also changed how I experience connection. I no longer feel responsible for holding everything together. I allow relationships to meet me where I am. Some do, some don't, and that difference no longer destabilizes me. I understand now that not all distance is disconnection. Sometimes it's discernment. I didn't stop being available. I stopped being overextended. I didn't stop caring. I stopped carrying. I didn't stop speaking. I stopped explaining. And in doing so, I found myself again, not as an idea, not as a role, but as a living presence in my own life. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this return, not the kind that announces itself or demands recognition, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there, the kind that allows you to walk into rooms without scanning for approval, the kind that lets you leave conversations without replaying them for hours afterward. This confidence isn't loud enough to impress anyone, but it's strong enough to hold you, and that, I've learned, is what matters. If there is one truth that has anchored itself through all of this, it is this. Slowing down did not make me irrelevant. It made me real. Choosing silence did not erase me. It revealed me. Unfocusing on myself did not make me selfish. It made me whole. I am not disappearing from my life. I am finally inhabiting it. And if you find yourself standing at the edge of that same quiet, wondering if stepping back means losing something, know this. What you lose are the roles that required you to abandon yourself. What you gain is everything that was waiting for you underneath the noise. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. And the middle is not a place of loss. It's the place where you come home.